Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. This is my first reunion, and it's great to see the faces of some of my old friends here. You know, it's really tough seeing my stuff this large because I draw on a 4x5-inch space, and now every flaw is so, out there. This is from the 2008 campaign, back when gas was selling for $5 a gallon in some places. I put it up because I'm going to blather on for a couple of minutes, and I thought you'd want a nice drawing to stare at while I did so. I've been the editorial cartoonist for the Sun-Sentinel, which is a major metropolitan daily newspaper in South Florida, for the past 26 years. Our circulation area covers Broward County, whose major city is Fort Lauderdale, and also Palm Beach County to the north. It's a great place for a journalist and an editorial commentator to work because there's always plenty of grist for my mill. I voted on the infamous butterfly ballot in the 2000 election, and so far as I know, I did not vote for Pat Buchanan. I don't know. Bush versus Gore, of course, was the local story of a lifetime. Famous people like Anna Nicole Smith have died there. Other famous people like Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter live there. Bernard Madoff used to live and operate there before he was invited to live elsewhere. Elian Gonzalez lived close enough for us to feel the hot breath of Cuban exile community passions. I'm fortunate that the management of my newspaper understands and appreciates the value of having its own editorial cartoonist. At last count, there were 55 of us working full-time now in the United States, but I think we offer a perspective to our readers that no other medium can communicate nearly as effectively, at least in print. Now, my work, as EJ mentioned, appears nationally, and I feel very strongly that as a cartoonist, as a member of his local as well as the larger national community, I ought to take the pulse and act as a resonator and focal point for shared feelings. I'm sure you're all aware of the demographics of southeastern Florida, so in this vein, I'd like you to imagine for a moment what kind of effect Al Gore's announcement in the year 2000 that Joe Lieberman would be his running mate must have had on my circulation area. My challenge was this: how in a 4x5-inch space do I swiftly and accurately characterize Senator Lieberman's first fundraising visit to Fort Lauderdale? Now, the 2000 election was a long time ago, but while we're on this subject, you've probably forgotten that another flamboyant local resident, Donald Trump, threw his hat in the ring for the presidency. Much to my disappointment, and I'm sure to that of other cartoonists around the nation, his campaign was short-lived. Those of us who live in and near Palm Beach County are used to his antics and appreciate him as a prickly but lovable eccentric. Again, how to characterize this unique individual and make a definitive comment on his campaign? Another thing I noticed while I was putting this talk together was that over my 30-year-plus career, I found myself addressing some of the same subjects over and over. It's as if they're a curse that we're unable to banish. And while some of the language and specifics might change over time, the underlying problems and motivations remain, and they're intractable. Now, I drew this during the summer of the 2008 presidential campaign, around the time of the first slide that I had up about gas prices. I was commenting on the fallacy of the argument being pushed by the drill baby drill crowd and how receptive the public was to it when its ability to think rationally had been degraded by $5 a gallon gas. Now, in spite of the currently unfolding tragedy in the Gulf, this rationale still amazingly has its adherents. An even better illustration of what I'm talking about is this one. Now, in light of recent events, I bet you wouldn't be surprised if I told you I drew it earlier this week. Well, I didn't. I drew it in May of 2001. Now, I'm going to shift gears here and talk about another role the cartoonist plays, which is that of advocate. Since I signed my work, I don't speak as the institutional voice of my paper the way unsigned editorials do. I'm like a columnist who happens to use words and pictures. I'm a member of the Sun-Sentinel's editorial board, and I contribute to the decision-making process as to what its official editorial opinion will be, but I'm solely responsible for what goes on in my rectangle. Humor is a tool that I use in my work, but it's only one in a large toolbox that includes ridicule, satire, parody, exaggeration, passion, pathos, shock, and revulsion, among others. It's a misconception that editorial cartoons always have to be funny. It's even more of a misconception that the funnier they are, the better. There are many ways to make an impact. Let's start with the abortion issue, which is one of those curses I spoke of that will always bedevil us as a nation. Now, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by explaining these cartoons, and I don't necessarily expect you to agree with them either. This was drawn in 2003 when a deficit of a few $100 billion seemed like an obscene amount of money, and that we'd be saddling future generations with its repayment. Those were the days, weren't they? By the way, I like combining seemingly unrelated topics wherever possible in cartoons, if some kind of logical thread can be found to connect them. Politics, I've learned, is like a large jigsaw puzzle full of constantly moving parts. Occasionally they match up for a moment, form the nucleus of a design, and then move their own separate ways. The puzzle, of course, is never solved. Now here's another one on a similar topic, which reflected my own disgust at the so-called small government types who picked and chose when to stick to their principles. This is from 2005, a couple of weeks after Katrina. Not exactly a knee slapper, right? Now, neither is this next one. Now, this was drawn, I think, when Samuel Alito was confirmed as a Supreme Court justice, and demonstrates the power of symbols in cartoons. The coat hanger, I realize, is a shocking image, and I debated with myself about whether using it might so alienate my audience that I would discuss them and fail to make my point. But I decided to use it anyway. The wonderful thing about being a journalist is you get to start all over again the next day with a clean slate. Now, here's another topic I put under the general heading of culture wars. Again, we're arguing many of the same points today that we were years ago, although we do seem to have made some grudging progress, at least in this specific category. Now, another generation from now, anyone who looks back at cartoons like these will probably think they're quaint. One of the reasons we can never move past these social issues is that it's so advantageous to bring them up and wave the bloody shirt during election years. Now, here I invoke the ghost of the late Lee Atwater and his never-to-be-forgotten contribution to Bush Sr.'s campaign. I drew this in 2004 when gay marriage, a term that still grated on many ears, was being used by the Bush camp as a cudgel against the Kerry Edwards ticket. As we know, initiatives that would protect so-called traditional marriage have a way of showing up on state ballots, particularly during election years, on the cynical assumption that loathing of those unlike ourselves is the greatest voting motivator of all. Social conservatives note that gay marriage is now hotter than repealing Roe v. Wade, although I've noticed that banning the teaching of evolutionary theory in public schools is coming up fast on the outside. Here's another comment on the sanctity of marriage. Now, I included this one because it's one of the most republished cartoons I've ever drawn and continues to pop up on sites across the internet, illegally, I might add, but the web has become the graveyard of copyright enforcement. It even appeared on T-shirts worn by gay rights marchers in Washington and on The Daily Show. It's also a very smooth segue to our next topic, which is the war in Iraq and how it defined the previous administration. Now, some of these next drawings you will find not the least bit amusing, and they aren't intended to be. I include them because they illustrate the point I made earlier about the tools available to a cartoonist and the various approaches to topics that he has at his disposal. Now, I looked at the copyright date on this, and I was amazed that I drew it only about 4 months after the Iraq War started in 2003. Much of the country was still gung-ho at this point, so I caught a lot of flack for it. Well, flack is mother's milk to a cartoonist. All we want is a reaction. The enemy is apathy. Now here we've moved on to 2007, and the mood of the country has changed considerably at this point. I received no negative comments about this cartoon and many positive ones. By this time, the term supporting our troops had lost its edge of admonition to doubters of our official policy and had instead come to mean not squandering our soldiers' service in pointless wars. This is the same year a few months later. I was voicing the frustration we all felt that the Iraqis were playing at petty politics while our soldiers were dying to provide them with the time and relative security to get their act together. Now, the only people who seemed to even remember that we were at war were members of the military community and politicians when they'd make pro forma statements about our brave Americans in uniform. Now, the administration did a fine job of keeping war's horrors from us, but it wasn't as though we were clamoring to be reminded. The economy was going swimmingly at the time. Occasionally, when it suited him, George Bush would refer to himself as a wartime president. The response would be a collective, "Oh yeah." Now, as you can see, I've managed to conflate the war with the environment here in one cartoon. Abu Ghraib was definitely a low point for all of us. That our young men and women could be capable of this kind of behavior made us collectively squirm and rattled our cherished belief in the myth of American exceptionalism. The damage it did abroad was incalculable, particularly since one of the stated reasons the war was being fought was to bring American values and reverence for the rule of law to a lawless place. Now let's get past this ugly stuff. I just want to show you a couple of cartoons here that are germane, but also bring up the subject of caricature, which is essential to effective cartooning. Without caricature, there's no parody, no exaggeration. It's one of the most important arrows in the cartoonist quiver. Now, I've tried to teach it to my winter study students, if that's the right word to use, and I've found it's like wiggling your ears. You can either do it naturally or you can't. Now, here we have a president who wasn't trusted to testify at the 9/11 Commission hearings without his keeper. Now, I love Dick Cheney. Along with Sarah Palin and Bill Clinton, he's one of God's gifts to cartoonists. His furtive eyes and his built-in sneer are evil incarnate. At first, I wondered whether the Senior Wenceslas analogy was too obsolete, but then I remembered the average age of my readership in South Florida is about 85, so I realized I didn't have to worry about that. Now, I used to be tougher on Ronald Reagan when I was a younger man. With the leavening of time and the degradation of civility in political discourse, Reagan's looking more and more like a reasonable gentleman to me. Now, when people ask me what is my favorite cartoon of the 9,000 plus I've ever drawn, this next one is it. I'm sure you remember the famous post-perjury apology tour. To me, this embodies everything an editorial cartoon should be. It's simple, its humor derives from caricature, it makes a point without having to use dialogue, and it's graphically punchy. It's the only original of mine that I have framed in my house. Now let's get back to issues that are stuck like bubblegum to the soles of our shoes, and just as hard to get ourselves rid of. Now, I drew this 4 years ago, but again, it could have been yesterday. Alluding to Native Americans when dealing with the immigration question is almost a requirement for an editorial cartoonist. Here's another one from the same topic from 2007. Okay, let's move on to the ongoing topic of the moment, the economy. Obviously, this has been a rich load of material for cartoonists ever since the bottom fell out. This is what I'd call my opening pitch, drawn in September of 2008 when the market took a nosedive. Now, this next one is actually about a short-lived story from 2000, and I'm including it here because I really didn't know where else to put it. Let's see, more on the economy. Yeah, I could tell. It makes you feel a little guilty to laugh at that one, doesn't it? I felt that way when I thought of the cartoon myself. In fact, because my industry has taken a huge beating, and I have a lot of colleagues who are in this same position. My state, Florida, has been especially hard hit by the recession because the two pillars of our economy are tourism and the growth of sprawl, or home building, as the industry likes to call it. When the news came out that even the crown jewel of our state's tourism industry was having to trim its workforce, I naturally had to make a comment. Our sister paper, which is the Orlando Sentinel, liked this one so much they also ran it. This one's from 5 years ago, but it could have run any time. Now I'm going to get into some miscellaneous stuff. I'm including these cartoons, these next few, because I like them, and I was thinking you might too. They illustrate that editorial cartoonists don't always deal with just political issues. First, I couldn't give a talk without showing at least one cartoon about one of South Florida's favorite sons. Now, in a local development that could only happen in a place like Palm Beach, shortly after this story broke, the exterior of Madoff's home was toilet papered by two teenage youths who were seeking retribution because his scheme had wiped out their trust funds. Now, I don't know what inspired this one, but every few months another flurry of stories comes out about how obese we are as a nation. My favorite angle is how much more gas we burn every year hauling the extra weight around. I'm always searching for that grand unified theory cartoon that combines overeating, the economy, global warming, gay marriage, immigration policy, government takeover of corporations, the Middle East, defective Chinese drywall, gun ownership, abortion, habitat destruction, the war on drugs, and creationism in the schools into one huge, complex, throbbing conceptual mass. And I hope I never come up with it, because then there'd be nothing left to draw and I'd have to retire. Now, this isn't political either, but it's still life-changing. I own a dumb phone. I don't know how to text, and I'm proud to say so. It's pretty clear that communication technology and social media are altering the very fundamentals of how our species interacts with itself. More interestingly, we're learning whether there's anything in our lives that isn't too trivial to communicate. But they probably said the same thing when the telephone first developed wide usage. But from my cranky point of view as a proto-geezer, the most destructive development is not the technology itself, but the invention of the unlimited calling and messaging plan. Now, I include this one because my editor is leery of running cartoons that address religion, unless the topic has entered the sphere of public discourse. Now, this has clearly been such an instance. I should mention here that while I'm like an independent columnist, none of my cartoons appears in print unless the editor-in-chief of the paper himself has seen them first, which puts me in a rather elite category of parental supervision. No other content provider, which is corporate newspeak for lower echelon working stiffs, rates this kid glove treatment. It's a testimony to the power of my medium. I'm not against this policy. In fact, I welcome it. More than once, my editor has saved me from myself when he discovered a way a cartoon could possibly be misinterpreted that might cause a meltdown in the readership. Cartoons about Israel and the Middle East, for example, are particularly sensitive. My editor and I have a relationship of mutual respect, and he's never refused to allow a cartoon to run simply because he disagrees with it, only because there might be a taste problem, like in the case of this next one, which I drew after Mel Gibson was stopped for DUI and let loose with his anti-Semitic rant shortly after he made the movie Braveheart. By the way, right after he spiked this cartoon, my editor requested the original so he could hang it in his office. He's got a whole gallery of them, by the way. Once the other editors had seen it, I got so many requests for copies that I finally added color and printed out a bunch. It became the most famous cartoon that no one ever saw. Now, this is a Middle East cartoon that did get through. Again, it could have appeared any time in the last 40 years. We have a cynical little saying in my editorial page department that there's only one Middle East editorial. We just keep it on file, trot it out, and reprint it whenever a new president comes along and opens a fresh peace initiative. Now, this cartoon has a particular poignancy for me. Again, it reflects the immutability of certain of the nation's problems. It could run tomorrow, but it actually ran on the morning of September 11th, 2001. After that morning, much about our attitudes changed, but not as much as you might think. I rummaged around in my archive to find some cartoons that would be emblematic of the way we all felt after that tragedy, and I found this. Now, at the time, I got a lot of positive feedback about it because we finally did feel like one unified nation after the attack. No more races, creeds, sexual orientations. We were all one. Now, 9 years later, the cartoon seems almost naive. The threat has receded in our minds, if not in reality, and thanks to economic insecurities, among other things, we've allowed ourselves to revert to all the old insular mindsets. If anything, we're more fragmented and riven than we were on September 10th, 2001. I drew this one a couple of months after 9/11 when we were still trying to accustom ourselves to the new reality of homeland insecurity. It's a wistful cartoon, too, because like the last one, it describes an idyllic state we'll have to give up hope of ever attaining. I can't talk about the post-9/11 era without alluding to the excesses we allowed ourselves to indulge in. Ironically, it was a tidal surge of patriotism and a natural desire to rally around our leaders at a time we were under attack that gave the administration license to push the bounds of legality and threaten our very core principles as a nation. It had become un-American to question the acts of our leaders when it came to matters of national security. Now, as you can see, I made a decision to depart from my usual cartoony style here and opted for a more representational depiction of the subject. I thought its starkness and simplicity would add impact. Now, the related debate over the use of torture is one that drove a deep wedge into our nation post-9/11. People of goodwill fell on both sides of the argument. I think this cartoon about Donald Rumsfeld, who's one of the last decades more complex and opaque characters, sums up what many of us felt about the whole enhanced interrogation issue. Just last week, in fact, President Bush came out of his self-enforced silence to declare that he'd do it all over again if he had to. What a joy it must be to be blessed with such conviction. I've heard many times from readers that it is only because our administration was willing to push the envelope that so-called knee-jerks like me enjoy the privilege of being able to criticize it, an argument that I can appreciate. There will always be tension between this viewpoint and that of those who feel that if we go too far down that road, there won't be much left about ourselves worth protecting. Now, I'd like to digress here for a moment to tell you a story. My friend, and in my opinion, the greatest living editorial cartoonist, Patrick Oliphant, lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a historic old adobe neighborhood. Don Rumsfeld has kept a vacation home for years about a block away. And after he was purged as defense secretary, he started spending a lot more time there. They cross paths now and then at the local convenience store when they grab coffee and pick up the paper. Fortunately, since Pat is a very private man, Rumsfeld doesn't know what he looks like, which is a good thing because Oliphant has drawn some of the most devastating cartoons about Rumsfeld that exist. One of Pat's favorite conceits is to draw him in a monocle and a Pickelhaube helmet and compare him to Kaiser Wilhelm. Anyway, about 2 weeks after Rummy left the Defense Department, Oliphant saw him on the street about a block ahead strolling along walking his dog. There was no fawning entourage, no phalanx of bodyguards. The dog did his business, and Rummy leaned over with a pooper scooper, cleaned it up, and moved on. As Oliphant summed it up, in no other nation on earth would the master of the most fearsome military machine the planet has ever known be forced out of office without violence and then just a few weeks later be an unassuming private citizen strolling along alone and cleaning up after his dog. Is this a great country or what? Now, the date in my archive shows that I drew this only 9 days after 9/11. Since I don't remember the emotional details of that period so clearly, I find this cartoon useful as a testimony as to how the nation must have been feeling at the time. Clearly, there were already concerns brewing that we might, in our retributory zeal, overreact in a dangerous way, and I was responding to them. We're getting to the beginning of the end here, so I'm going to move on to the Obama presidency. As we may recall, his real problems began the moment he was elected. Now, this was drawn during the transition. George Bush had, for all intents and purposes, all but checked out, and the nation was spinning out of economic control. As you may recall, Obama was the de facto president by December, and there was considerable frustration that he had assumed all the responsibility of office but possessed none of the power needed to get the job done. Except for its enormous symbolic significance, the inauguration itself was something of a formality. Now, I drew this cartoon during the great extended administration dither over whether to double down on Afghanistan or just declare victory and pull out. I'm still not sure what victory would mean, and I've yet to hear anyone give a clear explanation. I include this cartoon because it relies on an appreciation of history to make its point. Whenever a young person asks me what he or she should study to become an editorial cartoonist, I first suggest in the strongest possible terms that they should choose some other career. Maybe film animation, because really there's no future in this one. When I began my career in 1975, there were over 200 full-time cartoonists working for daily newspapers. As I said earlier, there are now 55. If after all that they're still interested, I tell them to forget art school and go and get a liberal arts education. I know I couldn't do this job if I hadn't had one of the best available. I tell them that developing and nurturing the thought process that goes into creating a cartoon is far more important than drawing skill, which can take care of itself later. Now, these next two are fairly recent. My feeling is that this country will never find the political will to solve its most grievous problems until our politicians stop being party creatures and start being Americans. But that would mean abolishing gerrymandered districts designed to protect incumbents and getting rid of the influence of money in politics, to cite just a couple of causes. If anything, we're backsliding in those departments. Now, the Tea Party movement's attempting to address some of these entrenched political problems from the ground up, but it brings along with it so much negative baggage that we'll just have to see how its candidates do in the general elections in November, when the great supine American independent middle finally gets to vote. Now, I drew this one in September of last year. Now, I'm thinking that rank-and-file Republicans, if not yet the leadership, are beginning to discover that while this strategy served them quite well for a while, it's beginning to fray with an exasperated public. The 5 months we have until the midterm elections is an eternity in politics, and we'll see if they've overstepped or if they moderate their position. I've saved another one of my favorite cartoons for last. To me, this one demonstrates that though there's much to complain about in our country, and what's more American than complaining about our country, we do at times manage to attain heights of greatness that pleasantly surprise even the bitterest of cynics. Now, I remember working late that night in November, as did all of us at the paper. The excitement was electric. Even reporters who covered beats that had nothing to do with the election were in the newsroom. We just wanted to be together as witnesses to history. I had 2 pencil sketches ready, depending on who won that night. It didn't seem right, actually, to ink one of them or both of them in advance for publication until we'd really heard the news. So when the networks officially called it for Obama at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, I set to work on this one and finished just in time for our press deadline, which was being held so that we could get more reaction news in. As I wrote in my blog the next day, it didn't matter whether your man won or not. It was a proud day to be an American. I don't even remember what the alternate cartoon was. Well, that's it. I'd like to thank the Alumni Office for giving me the honor of asking me to give this talk, and I thank you for staying to listen to it. I hope it was as much a pleasure for you as it was for me. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes? Sure. There are actually several parts to your question. I'll start with Andy Marlette, who comes from a distinguished heritage. His father was Doug Marlette, who unfortunately died in a car accident a few years ago, but he seems to be following his father's footsteps. Give him time. Cartoonists need to mature like fine wine, I guess, or maybe you catch them before they turn to vinegar, hopefully, I don't know. But I remember the stuff I was doing for the Williams record and the stuff I did for the first paper I worked for, which was in Shawnee, Oklahoma. I just hope that no one ever finds it, because when I look back, I'm amazed I ever got hired for anything. It's terrifying to look at. I try not to. And what happens is that, first of all, if you draw a cartoon every day for 35 years, you get better at it. You just can't help it. The other is that it is such a human process, as I hope I've been able to communicate. With the maturing of one's mind, and I would like to think some wisdom, you develop a way of looking at things that only comes from years. And my problem with that is that when I left Williams and started out, I moved to Oklahoma, which was an incredibly conservative environment. And from the class of 75, we were, you can just imagine what the political viewpoint was in those days on campus. And I came out there and I was stunned. It was a real culture shock. And I had a very hard time adjusting, and so did my readers. In fact, I finally lost my job over a very intemperate cartoon I did on Easter, wherein I depicted the first Easter celebration, where Jesus was holding up a three-legged stool as if he was selling it on TV, saying, all your, discounts for Easter celebration, easy credit terms take an eternity to pay. And I thought it was hilarious, and, the readership did not. They condemned me roundly from pulpits all around town, and I was ushered in and given my final paycheck, and that was it for me. Since that time, though, what happens with age is you develop, which is for a cartoonist, an unfortunate capacity to see all sides of an issue. And I would have preferred, in my 20s, as I'm sure young Mr. Marlette is doing, he sees things from one side only, or occasionally a couple. But my problem is that I know where everybody's coming from. And I mentioned earlier in my talk, that pushing the envelope of civil rights is something that some people feel is necessary. They've used an expression that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And I can really understand this argument. The problem is that in understanding someone else's point of view, it becomes much harder for you to be tough on them. And you become more moderate, and you become more understanding, and then you cease to, you have to worry about losing your edge. And that's a constant worry for me as I get, I wonder if I had more edge when I was younger. I don't know. But I'm constantly on the lookout to make sure I don't get too soft on everyone. Because to me, a cartoonist is supposed to elicit a response from readers. Otherwise, what's he doing? He's wasting everybody's time, including his own. So, other questions? Sadly, it can be explained very easily, economics. This has been, the newspaper industry has been on a decline ever since we graduated. A slow one, and then it accelerated more recently, especially with the internet. One thing I don't understand is how newspapers just like mine began giving away product on the internet that people used to pay to subscribe for. So why are they going to subscribe? And then the problem is that advertisers say, well, no one, your circulation's dropped, why should I pay as much money? And so, you can see how that goes. The other thing is that cartoonist work is circulated for an obscenely low amount of money. Now, I'm syndicated by Tribune Media Services out of Chicago, and a newspaper will pay to get a week's worth of my work pocket change. Now, in order to have a cartoonist on staff, you were paying someone with the experience of a senior writer, and they're going, wait a minute, why are we paying this much money and benefits and retirement and health and all this stuff to have somebody when I could be paying, you know, $100 a week to get someone else's work, which is, you know, what happens with my work. They get mine and they put it in their own little paper where they can't afford a cartoonist. What cartoonists have to do is make sure that they remain relevant at all times. And one of the things I do, which I didn't show you except in a couple of cases, is that I do a great number of local cartoons. Cartoons that can't come from anywhere else. So that whenever they think about, oh, let's get rid of Chan and, you know, get somebody else's stuff, they go, well, wait a minute, then we do all those great Broward County cartoons and the county commission and the, you know, Donald Trump and Madoff and all that. No, we better hang on to them for a while longer. You know, so that is what and all of us are doing that. I'd say I do at least one, often two, local cartoons a week out of the 5 that I draw. Yes. Well, I can't answer that question specifically because I don't know the answer. When I started out, I'd been out of Williams for about 2 months, and every night I went to bed terrified because I thought, I'm going to have to come up with an idea by tomorrow, otherwise they're not going to pay me anymore. And you can imagine what it's like to lie in bed at night trying to come up with something clever, pithy, you know, on point. I finally stopped worrying about it because I learned that I could do it. And it's just one of those things you just live with. Now, how do I come up with my ideas? Sometimes I go to sleep with a topic in mind. You know, I'll think, okay, Middle East, you know, recent developments, something happened, you know, and I go to sleep and I might wake up at 2 in the morning. I'm just lying there and all of a sudden something hits. And I write it down or I just try to remember it. And in the morning, it either sounds crazy or it's brilliant or whatever. And then I'm set for the day. You know, 24 more hours, I'm free. Or, you know, it might happen in the shower, or it might happen on my way to work, or it might happen reading the paper or the internet. I read a lot of papers. I look at a lot of stuff on the internet. You know, and what's occasionally things get really tough. You know, it gets to be, my deadline is 4 p.m. And that's because my copy editor likes to go home and pick up her kid from school or something. So I know that by 4, something's got to be there. And, you know, it gets to be 3:30, and, you know, little beads of blood are popping out on my forehead. And, you know, and finally it just somehow gets done. And in fact, it's the panic cartoons that are the best. I did one years ago when the Russian regime fell, you know, the fall of the Iron Curtain and Russia became, well, the Soviet Union ended. And I did I don't know if anybody remembers this, but there were a bunch of guys holed up in the government building and the tanks were attacking it and everything, and they finally gave up. And my editor came in and said, this is one of those rare cases where we're going to do an extra because this is so big that we're going to try to get something out on the streets by 1 in the afternoon. Now, I work for a morning paper, so, you know, normally we'd wait till the next day. We said, no, we have to do this. So he says, can you get something done in the next 15 minutes? And we'll get it in there, and then we'll have like really great coverage because, you know, you're so-and-so's writing an editorial and blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'll see what I can do, you know, like this. And I come up with this cartoon that is, it says across the top, new style of Russian neckwear. And I had 8 nooses just all the way across. And this ran in the New York Times, it ran in Newsweek, it ran in Time Magazine, it was just everywhere. And it was one of those things, you just, you know, in a panic situation, you somehow come through. And get one last thing before I move on, is that it's all about getting your mind in gear. For the last 35 years, my mind has been in a certain kind of gear where I look at things, I hear things, I read things, and I think, what kind of a cartoon would that make? How would I go about that? And if it's like a muscle, it's like being a track runner or something. You get in shape, and then you just, you know, and it's hard to go on vacation because, you know, I try not to pick up newspapers because I'm already working. You know, the paper, I'm reading and I'm going, what could, you know. So, a long way to answer your question. Anyway, yeah. Others? Yes. You know, that's a really good question, because I have this discussion with my editor all the time. And I've worked for, it's strange, I've worked at the Sun-Sentinel for 26 years, and for 22 of those I had the same editor. And I learned the way he thinks, and I learned what worked with him and what didn't. And I've got a new one now who's different. In fact, he's a Cuban American, which makes it really interesting. But we have to assume a certain level of intelligence on the part of anyone who looks at the editorial page. And I don't mean that in a snooty way. I'm just saying that there are a lot of people who read the papers, you know, just to get the sports section, or they read features, or, you know, where I live, they read obits. But people who go to the editorial page to get opinions, or read the op-ed page to get, you know, we run columns from the New York Times, that kind of thing, you figure they got to know something, or they wouldn't want to read someone's opinion on it. So it's a constant battle. How much do I dumb a cartoon down so that more people will get it? But in so doing, do I make it less rewarding for those who do get it? And I go back and forth, like the cartoon with Senior-Wences. You know, I knew I would lose everyone under about 50 years old, because they didn't grow up with Ed Sullivan. But the people that I got really liked it. And so you have to just go, okay, today is today. I'm going to go for this group. And, you know, Catholics all knew St. Peter's Basilica. A lot of people didn't. That's how it goes. You know, and a lot of people didn't know what the white smoke meant. You know, they didn't realize that the white smoke comes out when a new pope is chosen. So you just have to, you know, just say, okay, you know, there are going to be a few people who are really going to like this. I'm going to lose a lot, but so they'll come back tomorrow, and they'll, you know, it's funny, I get a lot of that. I get people who say, you know, I love your stuff, but I don't always understand it. And I don't take umbrage at all. You know, it's okay, you know, that's fine. Because not everyone, you know, it's not everyone's job like it is mine to be well informed. You know, they don't have the luxury. I know I only have about 10 seconds of their time when they look at my cartoon. So by nature, I try to keep my dialogues to a minimum. You know, I showed you a few where there was a good bit of writing, but, you know, that's because it absolutely had to be that way. And, you know, I couldn't figure out it. And that's another thing about, you know, I write a blog, as I mentioned. A lot of people are surprised when cartoonists know how to write. And I started out as a writer at, one of my first jobs at the paper was freelancing editorial cartoons to the paper while I did reporting and feature writing, classical music criticism. I was a TV columnist for a while. But with the blog, I've won a couple of awards with the blog, I'm pleased to say, and people always go, my God, you know, I didn't know you could write. And I go, you know, cartoonists probably know how to write better than anyone else, because we really know the value of a word. And when you're writing a dialogue for a cartoon, I sit there for half an hour going back and forth over different locutions, going, is there any way I could write this where I could drop a word or two? You know, make it even more concise. Is that word really necessary? You know, and it's like, you know, they said it would take Hemingway 8 hours to write 100 words or something. I'm not comparing myself to Hemingway, but I'm saying that's the kind of effort that goes into writing for a cartoon. I don't have the luxury of, you know, 7 column inches or 350 words. I've got to make it, you know, work right then. So, okay, anyway, enough. Yeah. I don't know. I started drawing caricatures of my teachers in grade school, and got me in a lot of trouble because they all knew who did it, you know. And you know, people would, I loved getting a reaction, like, you know, listening to you folks respond to my cartoons is great, because, you know, I work in an office and it goes out in print, and I don't hear people laugh at the other end or respond or call me a jerk or whatever. And so, of course, in school, I loved, you know, passing these things around and hearing people laugh one after another as they passed. And of course, the teacher would walk over and say, what the hell is this? And, oh, right, yeah. And so I ended up, like, facing the wall a lot. I remember in the 3rd grade, I learned a lot about geography because I was facing this map. And I remember I spent a lot of time, and as I got older, I learned that, you know, my knowledge grew the higher you got up on the world map. So when I was like in the third grade, I knew all about Tierra del Fuego and the Cape of Good Hope. And then as I got older, I started learning about Canada and Greenland, and, you know. So anyway, I did that, and when I did a lot of writing, drawing for my high school. I went to a prep school in Los Angeles, and then I did illustration for them. And then when I came to Williams, I did a comic strip for what at the time was called the Record Advocate, because we had two papers that merged into one, and now I guess it's called the Record again. And you know, and those, I hope no one can find them, like I said. But anyway, that really got me going. I realized that I liked working in a single frame, and I've never really, comic strips has never appealed to me, and very few of my cartoons are multi-panel. They are once in a while, and that's the only, you know, conception I can get to make my point. But generally, I just like that instant, you know, and I've never gotten into animation much either, because to me, I mean, a lot of cartoonists are getting into animation. First of all, it's very hard work. It takes hours and hours to do it the old-fashioned Disney way, and it takes even longer to do it the new-fashioned technological way. And you have to spend about 6 months of your life learning the animation programs. It comes out looking like hell, and it takes too long. Plus, you start looking at an animated cartoon, and for me, within the first 10 seconds, they've telegraphed the whole message, and I don't need to watch the rest of it. I want to get it all in one frame, right then and there, like a snap, you know, right between the eyes. So I've always loved this job, and, you know, I really, you know, some people say, well, you know, would you ever do anything else? Well, no, I can't. You know, I don't know how. Anyway, yeah. Well, we are all in contact, and we belong to a professional association called the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists, which it's like one of those tontines. You know, we keep joking we ought to have like a bottle of brandy, and the last guy left gets to drink it, you know. And yeah, I mean, it's such a small fraternity that we all know each other really well. In fact, I'm here and not in Portland, Oregon, because they're having their annual convention this year right now. Well, maybe in 2 days, but I had to make a choice. And I've never been back to Williams, so, I mean, for reunion. And yeah, we support each other more in terms of our employment situation, which is always tenuous. Not all of us are as lucky as I am to have an editor who understands and respects the value of what we do. Some guys, they walk in one day and they go, sorry, we had to cut, and we realize that you don't do much for us. Well, you know, that's, when you've done this all your life, it's pretty harsh to suddenly realize that you have no value. And I just landed in the right place by accident. Yeah, we share a lot of, you know, hard luck stories with each other, strategies, you know, how do you deal with an editor, how do you deal with copyright infringement, which is, as I said, a huge problem. I mean, you know, things like that. So it's like any small fraternity. Yeah, yes. That's called a MacGuffin, which tells you, yeah, a lot. I was fortunate to be on vacation during the week of 9/11 because I was sitting on a train in Canada when I heard the news, when somebody came on board at one of the stops and said, you're never going to believe this, somebody just flew a plane into the World Trade Center. And the first cartoon I thought of was a weeping Statue of Liberty. I came back to the U.S. about 2 weeks later and found that there had been about 30 cartoons of weeping statues of liberty drawn. And there are certain ideas, and that's just an example of one, there are certain ideas that just lend themselves to being dealt with in a certain way. And a lot of cartoonists, you know, we're all different people, but I guess the thought process is such that you'll look, say, on a Sunday in the New York Times, you go, wait a minute, why didn't they use mine? It's exactly the same as his. And it's just because they happen to see his first. Oh, by the way, I use the word his advisedly. There are about 2 or 3 women in this business. I don't know why, but the rest of us are all men. Anyway, that answers your question. It does happen. Yes.
Are you having any success on copyright infringement?
No. No, not at all. It's incredible. The organizations like newspapers and magazines, they're honest and they let you know when they're running your stuff and they pay you a royalty fee. There are bloggers who run your stuff and they just think that because it's on the internet and because they can do that copy-paste thing that it's theirs. And they use it in all manner of ways. And I've had people actually take them and alter them. They put in different words. They'll change them to fit their own, and they don't even bother to remove my signature. They just, put it on there, and then, we go, and my wife and I, sometimes she trolls the internet, and she'll find these things, and she'll write them and say, under threat of legal action, which is, of course, BS, but, at least you can try. It's annoying, to see your work and particularly when it's used to make a point that's the opposite of what you wanted in the cartoon. Someone with a special interest blog, say on, Right to Life, and they use one of my pro-choice cartoons to, illustrate what, crazy knee-jerk liberal, anti-American types are thinking, that kind of thing. So, yeah, there's not much you can do. There is some copyright technology that they're learning about, electronic watermarking, where you can't run the cartoon without having it say copyrighted across, but they do it anyway. So. Yes. Yeah, that's called an evergreen, right? Yeah, money in the bank, right? I don't do it anymore. I used to when I was younger. And I would change them periodically as they did run out of time and they got a little bit too shop worn or dusty or something. But no, I just kind of wing it now. Throw a dart at the wall, see what happens. Yes. Well, I did have Sarah Palin for a while, but my editor got tired of it. So she's not my whipping girl anymore, but I did love Sarah Palin. I mean, now she really has to do something egregious for me to get anything through about her. Ronald Reagan in the 80s, I mentioned I've mellowed about him, but Reagan I enjoyed a lot doing because he was so, he really believed in his viewpoint, and that is great for a cartoonist, someone who never wavers. The problem I have with Obama is that he's not really, he's not strongly anything. A lot of people, conservatives, will say, oh, he's a wild-eyed liberal, but he really isn't, and he's not, he actually does govern from the center, although a lot of people don't agree with this, but he's very tough to do because he's not doctrinaire, and it's the same with you probably heard of my governor, Charlie Crist. Who's running as an independent. He's all over the place, and he's spineless. And it's hard to deal with spineless people. You have to deal with people who really believe in something strongly. That's the best kind of target. Yes. Yeah, we do. We have a few young people, but not too many. A lot of the young ones are doing their own stuff online, and they're not employed full-time. I don't know if that's a demarcation we should worry about. I mean, a lot of great stuff is being done on the internet. No one's making any money on it. So, I guess, my group, we tend to get older. I mean, I remember when we were all the young Turks back in the 1970s and 80s, and now we're the geezers. The problem is that, we go to the conventions now, and there really aren't that many young guys wanting to stay up all night getting drunk. The rest of us want to go to bed at 9 o'clock and take our X-Lax and, yes. I love The Daily Show, and I occasionally watch The Colbert Report, but The Daily Show to me is one of the sharpest things going. I like reading The Onion, which is a satirical online thing. I read a lot of opinion columnists. I read Maureen Dowd because I love the way she writes, and Tom Friedman, who to me is just practically clairvoyant. I love this guy's stuff. I mean, I wish more people would listen to him, because if they did, maybe we'd actually make some progress. But I don't really look or read at anything to get inspired in terms of humor. Again, humor to me isn't necessarily the most important thing. But I do read certain things in order to be informed and to make intelligent decisions about where I'm going to go on a topic. Yes. Well, Herb Block is he's still monumental in our. I mean, there will never be another Herb Block. I'd say Pat Oliphant, the guy I was talking about earlier, is probably the greatest. Most of us would agree is the greatest living editorial cartoonist. He's been a tremendous influence. It's Oliphant who's responsible for the horizontal cartoon. Herb Block, you may remember. I'm sorry. Herb Block did vertical stuff. And Oliphant came over from Australia as a young man and started drawing horizontal cartoons. And the value of those is you could read from left to right. You could tell a narrative because people naturally read from left to right unless they're, reading Arabic or Hebrew. And so you can set up a punchline over here, as you probably saw, and then you finish it over here. And that was a boon for cartoonists to be able to do that because Herb Block never really did that. So, and Oliphant keeps reinventing himself every 10 years or so, doing something entirely new that no one ever thought of. And so we sort of follow in his footsteps in a way. I think I'll take like one more question, and then I don't want to keep you guys here too long. Yes. Our association recognizes and does convene with cartoonists from Canada and Mexico. Canadians are phenomenal cartoonists, and they have brought over that British tradition of caricature that it's just such a fine art form the way the Canadians do it. Mexicans are problematic because I don't know if they still do this, but the government used to provide them with housing and salaries and perks so that they wouldn't attack the leaders. And it worked out pretty well for the government, I must say, because they did quite well, and there were just certain topics they would never touch. I don't know if Mexican cartoonists are still that way, and perhaps I'm slandering them now. I don't know. Anyway, I just want to thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure.